I never wanted a normal backyard. I wanted silence. I wanted a place where the only interruptions came from the wind through the pines or the distant cry of an eagle. A place where the world's chaos couldn't touch me. So I bought a mountain. A real one. Not just a patch of land with a for sale sign, but a wild, untouched peak that looked like it had been carved out for dreams like mine. The first time I stood on that summit, the sun cutting through the mist, I felt something I hadn't in years, a calm that reached into my bones. I could see for miles. Rolling valleys, rivers snaking like silver ribbons, and forests so dense they seemed to hold their own secrets. I laughed almost foolishly and whispered to myself, "Finally, my world." I had a small cabin built near the edge of a clearing. Nothing fancy, just enough to sleep, cook, and hide from anyone brave or foolish enough to try to find me here. I imagined the life I'd have. Mornings drinking coffee while watching the mist lift, nights lying under the stars, and days wandering trails that were mine alone. At first, it was exactly what I had imagined. I walked the trails with the ease of a man who knew he had nowhere to be but here. I tracked the paths, counted the trees, memorized the streams. And I laughed at the thought of my neighbors, if you could even call them that. Just a few squirrels, maybe a deer, and the occasional curious hawk. No HOA meetings, no loud cars, no phone calls about sprinklers or fences. Pure freedom. But freedom has a funny way of attracting attention. I noticed it first in small things, a broken branch where no animal should have passed, footprints that weren't mine, snares that hadn't been there yesterday. I tried to laugh it off. Probably a hiker, I told myself. But hikers don't set traps. Hikers don't leave the smell of fear in the forest. Then one night I heard it. A sound so faint it could have been imagined. The snap of a twig, careful but deliberate. My heart stopped. I froze. Somewhere in the darkness, someone or something was moving closer to my cabin. I didn't run. I didn't even make a sound. I watched from the window as shadows slipped between the trees. I realized with a sinking feeling that my paradise wasn't as empty as I had believed. The next morning I inspected the area. There were clear signs now, broken traps that looked hastily dismantled, footprints that were too big for any deer or bear, and the unmistakable smell of humans. My chest tightened, a mix of anger and fear. These weren't ordinary intruders. These were poachers, people who took what wasn't theirs without a second thought. I remember sitting on the porch, staring at the forest, feeling a strange mixture of awe and dread. The mountain that had promised freedom now whispered a warning. "You are not alone," it seemed to say, and I knew in that moment that my life up here was about to change forever. But I wasn't about to back down. This mountain, every rock, every tree, every hidden path, it was mine. And anyone who thought they could step onto it without consequences was about to learn a very hard lesson. I spent the rest of the day walking the trails, setting small markers, watching the shadows, learning the rhythm of the mountain. And as the sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in shades of fire, I made a silent promise to myself. If they come, they won't leave the same way. That night I lay in my cabin, listening to the wind, every snap and rustle amplified in the dark. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were out there. I felt a mix of fear, excitement, and determination bubbling inside me. This was no longer just a mountain. It was a battlefield, and I had all the home field advantage. I closed my eyes, imagining the confrontation to come. My hands itched to prepare, to protect, to fight. And deep down, I knew one thing for sure. This mountain had chosen me as its guardian, and it would not let anyone, no matter how cunning, steal it away. The morning after the first night of unease, I set out on the trails with a mix of anticipation and dread. Every leaf that rustled, every branch that cracked underfoot made my pulse quicken. I kept telling myself it could just be the wind, that I was imagining things, but deep down I knew better. As I moved deeper into the forest, I noticed more signs, small at first but unmistakable. Footprints pressed into soft soil, broken twigs that suggested deliberate movement, and even faint traces of fire from a small, makeshift camp. Whoever had been here wasn't just wandering. They were planning, observing, and worst of all, unafraid. I crouched behind a fallen log, peering through the morning mist. My stomach knotted as I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, careful and deliberate, yet confident, like they had walked these trails before. My first instinct was to yell, to confront them, but something in my gut told me to wait, to watch. to learn. They were poachers, I realized, seasoned and skilled, not the clumsy trespassers I had imagined. They carried themselves with a quiet menace, speaking in low tones I couldn't make out. They set traps along the paths I had mapped the day before, moving like ghosts through my mountain. And in that moment I felt a surge of anger, not just for myself, but for the animals they would kill, for the land they didn't understand or respect. I went back to my cabin, mind racing, hands shaking slightly from the mix of fear and adrenaline. I started planning. Not with guns or brute force yet. No, I needed patience, observation, cunning. I set up cameras along the trails, hidden among rocks and branches. I marked paths with subtle signs only I would notice. And at night, I would sit in my cabin, listening, learning, feeling the pulse of the mountain around me. I remember one night vividly. I heard voices, low and tense, moving past my cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I stayed perfectly still, the darkness pressing in around me. They didn't see me. I watched them pause by the edge of a clearing, one of them bending to inspect a trap I hadn't yet noticed had been tampered with. I almost smiled. Not because of cruelty, but because the mountain and I were in this together now. I had always dreamed of a sanctuary, a place untouched, and now it was alive with purpose, warning the intruders in its own quiet way. The next few days were a blur of tracking and preparation. Every morning I walked the trails, studying footprints, noting changes, anticipating their movements. I learned their rhythm, when they came out, where they lingered, how they reacted to obstacles. It was like a dark dance, and for the first time in years I felt truly awake, truly alert. One evening I spotted them again. They hadn't seen me yet, crouched low near the creek, whispering to one another. I could see the glint of metal, knives, maybe a rifle, and I realized the stakes had just risen. This wasn't trespassing anymore. This was a war for the mountain. I stayed hidden, watching as they left small markers of their presence, a pile of stones here, a broken branch there. And I began to understand something vital. They were confident because they underestimated me. They thought the mountain was theirs for the taking. They didn't know it had chosen a guardian. That night I barely slept. Every sound in the forest made me tense, every shadow seemed alive. But I felt something else too, determination. Fear had sharpened into focus. I couldn't let them win, not here, not on this mountain that had already become part of me. I made a promise to myself as I stared out at the moonlit peaks. If they returned, if they thought they could steal what was mine, they would learn the mountain doesn't forgive intruders. And I, for all my human limitations, would make sure they understood that lesson in a way they would never forget. I didn't know exactly how yet, I didn't know when. But I knew one thing clearly, this mountain was alive and it had given me a responsibility. To protect it, to defend it, and to survive alongside it. And that night, as the wind howled through the trees and the shadows lengthened like fingers across the forest floor, I felt it deep in my bones. The first move had been made. The poachers had stepped onto my mountain, and the game had just begun. Days on the mountain started to blur together. I woke before dawn, the sky barely lightening, and walked the trails with eyes sharp as a hawk's. Every leaf, every broken twig, every subtle disturbance told a story, and the story I was reading wasn't a good one. The poachers were clever, careful, and patient, but so was I. I started calling it a game, but not the kind you laugh about. A deadly, tense chess match where every move counted and one misstep could cost me everything. The mountain had become my partner, whispering through rustling leaves, revealing paths, hiding me from prying eyes. I could feel it guiding me, showing me secrets no outsider could know. And I had to pay attention. One slip and they'd notice me. I watched them from afar, shadows moving silently between trees, the glint of a knife in the sunlight catching my eye. They weren't expecting me to be this vigilant. They thought the mountain was theirs for the taking, a playground for their greed. But they hadn't counted on a guardian who knew every ridge, every hollow, every hidden crevice. Some nights I would lie in my cabin, straining to hear the slightest rustle, the tiniest movement. Sleep came in fragments, and dreams were filled with the forest closing in on me. Sometimes I imagined them stepping closer, whispering threats I couldn't hear. Other times I imagined the traps I would set, the ways I could make them pay for every footprint on my land. I remember one evening vividly. The sun had just dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in gold and crimson. I crouched behind a ridge, binoculars pressed to my eyes, and watched a man carefully move through the clearing. He stopped to inspect something, one of the small markers I had left days before. He frowned, muttered something, and moved on. I felt a mix of satisfaction and unease. They were aware now that the mountain had someone watching, and that made them dangerous. But I didn't panic. I stayed calm. I reminded myself that fear could paralyze, but observation could empower. I mapped their movements in my mind, predicting where they would strike next. Every shadow became a potential threat, every sound a clue. The mountain had trained me to read it like a book, and I was learning faster than they expected. At night, the forest felt alive. Not in a comforting way, but in a tense, electric way. The wind whispered warnings, the trees groaned under their own weight, and distant calls of animals sounded sharper, almost as if they were signaling danger. I realized I wasn't alone, and neither were they. This wasn't just me versus intruders. It was me and the mountain versus anyone foolish enough to try to take it. I also started noticing their patterns. They moved mostly at dusk and dawn, avoided open areas, and communicated with subtle gestures instead of words. It was eerie, the way they worked in perfect silence like ghosts blending into the shadows. And yet I caught small mistakes. A snapped branch, a footprint in soft mud, a discarded piece of trash. Little things that revealed they weren't perfect, that even the cleverest can slip. I spent hours thinking about what I would do next. I didn't want to rush. The mountain had taught me patience, and I was learning to trust it. Every trap I would set, every plan I would execute needed to be precise. They were bold, but boldness can become arrogance, and arrogance can be fatal. By the time the moon rose high, casting pale light across the forest floor, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and dread. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was hunting, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And I knew deep down that when that moment came, the mountain would be on my side and they wouldn't know what hit them. That night, as I lay in my cabin listening to every sound, I felt it. The tension of the forest pressing close, the anticipation of confrontation lingering in the air. The poachers were out there, moving in shadows, unaware that every step they took was being watched. And I whispered to myself, half in fear, half in determination, the game has only just begun, and the mountain always wins. I had been watching them for days, learning their habits, predicting their movements, and mentally preparing for the inevitable. I knew this day would come, the moment when patience met action. And when it did, I felt a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and, oddly, exhilaration. It was just before dawn, the forest still draped in shadows and mist. I crouched behind a fallen tree, my heart hammering in my chest, listening to every sound. The faint crunch of leaves under boots, the rustle of the underbrush, the occasional distant call of a bird, it all felt amplified, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then I saw them, two of the poachers, moving cautiously along a narrow trail. One of them carried a small cage, I assumed for an animal, and both glanced around as if expecting trouble. I didn't move. I didn't breathe too loudly. I had to let this happen exactly as planned. I triggered the first trap I had set. A simple net, hidden cleverly beneath leaves and branches. It snapped upward with a soft whoosh, tangling one of the men in a heap. His eyes went wide in shock, mouth opening to scream, but the forest swallowed the sound. The second poacher froze, looking around in panic, trying to locate the source of the trap. I could see his hands shaking, and for a split second I almost felt pity. Almost. Then he stumbled into my second trap, a cleverly concealed tripwire attached to a basket of debris. He fell forward, sprawling in the dirt, groaning as the mountain itself seemed to close in around him. I stayed hidden, observing every reaction, feeling my chest tighten with a mix of adrenaline and satisfaction. They were smart, but not smart enough. They didn't know this terrain. They didn't know the eyes in the shadows, and they certainly didn't know the patience of someone who had made this mountain their home. I could hear them scrambling, cursing under their breath, trying to free themselves from the nets. And yet there was no panic in me, only clarity. This was my land, and I wasn't about to let them ruin it. Every step they had taken, every careless move, had led them straight into my hands. I remember the moment I realized the mountain itself was on my side. A fallen branch cracked under the weight of one of the poachers, drawing him back into the net's snare. A rock shifted slightly under my touch, causing the other to stumble and fall face first into a patch of brambles. I didn't need to intervene yet. The forest was doing it for me. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost its meaning in the adrenaline-fueled fog. I stayed hidden, watching them flail, exhausted, frustrated, and terrified. And I thought, not without a grim humor, how ironic it was that they had come here seeking easy prey, only to find a mountain that refused to yield. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a faint whistle coming from deeper in the forest. Another poacher? Reinforcements? I didn't know, but I knew I had to act. I triggered a secondary trap I had been testing for days, a tripwire attached to a heavy branch. It swung down with precise force, cutting off their escape path and forcing them toward the clearing I had prepared. By now, both were tangled, exhausted, and terrified. Their eyes darted everywhere, realizing, perhaps too late, that this wasn't just a trap, it was a warning. I stayed hidden, heart-pounding, silently savoring the moment without celebrating. There would be no boasting, no unnecessary violence. Just justice, the way the mountain demanded it. Finally, I stepped out slowly, keeping my hands visible, my voice calm but firm. "This mountain doesn't forgive," I said, and the words seemed to echo through the trees. The poachers froze, fear washing over them, faces pale, bodies trembling. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten. I let the weight of the moment, the realization that they had trespassed on land that had chosen its guardian, sink in. I knew one of them had already tried to escape earlier, and that uncertainty hung in the air. But for now, the first strike had been made. The mountain had spoken, and the intruders had learned, painfully, that nothing here came easily. As I watched the sun rise over the peaks, casting gold across the forest floor, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. This was only the beginning. The poachers had been dealt with, but the mountain had more lessons to teach, and I wasn't finished yet. The forest never slept, and neither could I after the first strike. A strange energy settled over the mountain, a mix of quiet victory and an unspoken warning. But victory was only temporary. One of the poachers had escaped, and I knew he wasn't going to run and hide. He would come back, and this time he wouldn't make the same mistakes. I spent the next few days like a shadow myself, moving silently through the trails, mapping the intruders, previous paths, checking my traps, and listening to every sound the forest offered. The wind whispered secrets if you paid attention. The rustle of leaves, the subtle shift of branches, even the faint smell of smoke carried messages. And I had learned to read them. The escaped poacher became my obsession. I imagined him moving through the same woods, thinking he could outsmart me, thinking he could take the mountain for himself. Every footstep he took left a mark, every mistake a clue, and I knew that with patience, every mistake would be his undoing. I set new traps, more elaborate than before. Nothing deadly yet. I wanted fear to sink in first, to teach a lesson the way the mountain demanded. Hidden nets, tripwires, noisy debris, all carefully arranged so that the forest itself seemed to be hunting him. And then I waited. Waiting is harder than action. Hours stretched like days. Every snapping twig made my heart jump, every distant call of a bird put me on alert, and every shadow that flickered across the corner of my eye was suspect. Sleep came in short bursts, and dreams were filled with the poacher's eyes, the glint of his knives, and the subtle, sinister feeling that he was always just out of sight. Then I caught a glimpse of him, a dark silhouette moving along a familiar ridge just at dusk. He was cautious, aware, and skilled. But he didn't know the mountain had already chosen me as its guardian. I followed him silently, moving through the undergrowth, avoiding dry leaves that could betray my position. Every step I took was calculated, measured, precise. He paused at a creek, crouched down, and splashed water on his face. I watched from a distance, hidden in the shadows, feeling a strange mix of fear and anticipation. He didn't notice me, not yet, and that mistake, just one small lapse in vigilance, was all I needed. I began guiding him toward my next trap, a cleverly concealed snare along a narrow path, partially hidden by fallen branches and leaves. The poacher moved cautiously, muttering under his breath, cursing the mountain that seemed to conspire against him. I felt a grim satisfaction. He was walking right into it. Then, unexpectedly, he paused and looked around sharply. My pulse quickened. Had he sensed me? My heart hammered in my chest, but I stayed still, blending with the shadows, listening to his movements. Slowly, deliberately, he continued, but now I could see the tension in his shoulders, the nervous twitch in his hands. He was afraid, and that fear made him sloppy. I triggered the trap, A net sprang up, tangling his legs. He fell with a grunt, scrambling, cursing, panic flashing in his eyes. I didn't step forward yet. I let him flail, let the mountain itself do the work. Branches snagged his clothing, rocks tripped him, and the forest seemed alive with its own silent judgment. Hours passed in a tense blur. He tried to free himself, growling in frustration and fear. Every movement, every attempt to escape only trapped him further. I stayed hidden, silent, watching, my mind sharp and focused. I knew patience was the ultimate weapon. The mountain and I had the advantage. By the time night fell, he was exhausted, trapped in the clearing I had prepared. I finally emerged, stepping into the moonlight, hands empty, voice calm but firm. "You shouldn't have come back," I said, and it was as if the forest itself echoed my words. He froze, his eyes wide with realization. For a moment I felt almost pity, almost, but the mountain had no mercy for those who trespassed, and neither did I. That night I lay in my cabin, listening to the wind swirl through the peaks, every shadow alive with memory of the hunt. One poacher remained free, the one who had eluded me from the start, and I knew that the final confrontation was coming sooner than I expected. I closed my eyes and felt it in my bones. The hunt was far from over. The mountain had given me power, patience, and clarity, and the remaining poacher would soon learn what it meant to challenge both me and the land I had sworn to protect. The forest had a rhythm now, and I had learned to move with it. Every rustle, every distant howl, every snap of a twig became part of a pattern I could read. The mountain was alive in ways I hadn't imagined when I first bought it. It whispered warnings, offered hiding places, guided my steps. And I knew, deep down, that the final confrontation was coming. The poachers I had trapped were already learning what it meant to challenge this place. Their fear radiated through the trees like smoke, settling over the ridges and valleys. But one remained, the one who had eluded me from the beginning, and I could feel his presence, faint but unmistakable. He thought he had time, he thought he could plan, he thought he could survive. He was wrong. I moved carefully, almost like a shadow myself, through trails I had memorized, over rocks I had climbed countless times, past streams and fallen logs that had become part of me. The mountain was on my side. Every step I took, every breath I drew, felt like the forest breathing with me, watching me, guiding me. I spotted him just as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the clearing. He was cautious, tense, and fully aware now that he wasn't alone. His eyes darted constantly, searching for movement, but he couldn't see what was invisible, me. I stayed downwind, hidden in the shadows of a large pine, watching him. My heart raced, but not with fear. This was focus, pure and sharp, the kind that comes when every instinct is honed for survival and protection. I had prepared for this. I had studied his patterns, anticipated his moves, and arranged the forest itself to be my ally. I set a small diversion, a pile of rocks that would tumble if disturbed. He stepped on it, froze, cursed under his breath, and glanced around. Perfect. I let him move forward, herding him toward a narrow path I had prepared with snares and branches positioned to entangle him. Every step he took, I calculated, and the mountain seemed to echo my plan, every rock, every tree conspiring to close in. Then suddenly he stopped and looked straight toward me, or at least where I was hidden. My pulse leapt. I froze, barely daring to breathe. Did he see me? Was this it? Had he finally spotted the guardian of this mountain? But after a tense moment, he shook his head and moved on. Luck, skill, or overconfidence, I couldn't be sure. But I knew he was making mistakes now, mistakes I could exploit. I pressed on, carefully maneuvering around him, cutting off his possible escape routes. The forest seemed to shift with me, opening paths where I needed them, blocking paths where he might flee. I realized, almost in awe, that I had become part of the mountain, and the mountain had become part of me. Together, we were unstoppable. As night began to fall, I finally cornered him near a ridge overlooking the valley. He was trapped now, fatigue and fear etched into his face. The cleverness that had allowed him to evade me before was gone. He had nowhere to go, nothing left to hide behind. I stepped from the shadows, my voice calm but firm. "It ends here," I said, letting the words echo across the trees. He froze, his eyes wide, realizing that the mountain itself had delivered him into my hands. There was a tense silence, broken only by the wind rustling through the pines. He moved slightly, testing the edges of the trap I had guided him into, and I knew he would never slip past me again. Every careful step, every plan he had made had led him straight into this moment. I didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. That wasn't the way of the mountain. But I allowed myself a small, grim smile. This was justice, slow and deliberate, measured by the rhythms of the land and the lessons it demanded. As I watched him struggle to comprehend his situation, I felt a surge of emotion, relief, exhaustion, and something deeper. I had defended what was mine, yes, but I had also learned something about myself. About patience, strategy, and the quiet satisfaction of watching the land protect itself through me. Night fell fully and the mountain lay quiet around me, the kind of silence that feels sacred. The poachers had been dealt with. One remained, but the endgame was near. I settled into my cabin, listening to the whispers of the forest, knowing that the final confrontation was coming soon, and that when it did, the mountain and I would see it through to the end. The night was black as pitch. The kind of darkness that presses in on you makes the trees seem taller, the shadows deeper. I could feel it, my pulse thrumming in my ears, my senses on high alert. The last poacher was out there somewhere, moving like a ghost, thinking he could escape the mountain that had already claimed his companions. I didn't speak, I didn't move carelessly. Every step I took was deliberate, silent, in rhythm with the forest. The mountain had taught me patience, and I had learned well. I knew his patterns, his habits, the subtle cues that betrayed his presence. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind through the leaves told me he was close. And then I saw him, a shadow slipping between trees, cautious, tense, aware that something was hunting him, but he didn't know what. He didn't know that I had already prepared every step of his path, every trap, every snare. I followed him quietly, letting him guide himself into the net I had woven for him. He paused at the edge of a clearing, crouched low, scanning the forest. I could see the fear in his eyes now. He realized, finally, that he was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. But panic is a poor ally in the forest. It made him sloppy, reckless, and predictable. I triggered the first of the final traps, a tripwire connected to a hidden net. It shot up, tangling his legs, throwing him forward with a grunt. He struggled, flailing, his frustration and fear mounting with each failed attempt to free himself. I stayed hidden, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The mountain itself seemed to close in around him. Rocks shifted, branches snagged, and the undergrowth tangled at his feet. I had guided him here using every ridge, every hollow, every secret path I knew. And now he had nowhere to run. I stepped out of the shadows slowly, hands empty, voice calm but firm. "It ends here," I said. My words echoed through the trees, carrying the weight of authority, of inevitability. His eyes widened in terror. For the first time, he understood that he had underestimated not just me, but the mountain itself. He lunged, desperate, trying to free himself from the net, but I was ready. I didn't need to strike him physically. He was already ensnared by his own recklessness and the traps I had set. Every move he made only trapped him further. "You should have never come here," I said, stepping closer, letting him feel the calm certainty in my presence. "This is not your land, this is mine, and the mountain doesn't forgive trespassers." He stopped struggling for a moment, fear washing over his face. I could see the realization settling in. Hours, maybe days, of careful planning on his part had led him straight into my hands. He was exhausted, defeated, and utterly alone. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the mountain around me. It had been my ally, my teacher, and now my instrument of justice. I didn't feel pride exactly. There was no triumph in this, only clarity. This was survival, protection, and the lesson that the wilderness will always favor those who respect it. He finally slumped in defeat, tangled in the net, too tired and scared to resist. I could see the toll this chase had taken on him, his clothes torn, his body scraped, his spirit broken. And I understood in that instant that this mountain had chosen me for a reason. Not just as a home, but as a guardian, someone who would see the intruders for what they were and ensure they never threatened it again. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying a sense of finality. The other poachers had been dealt with, and now this last one was caught. The forest seemed to exhale, releasing the tension that had built over weeks. Silence settled, heavy and complete, like a seal on everything that had happened. I looked around at the peaks, the valleys, the dense forest stretching as far as I could see. I knew this night would be remembered by the mountain, and by me, as the moment the intruders learned the true cost of their greed. I had protected my land, yes, but I had also learned something about myself, the strength, patience, and focus that comes when you are pushed to your limits. And as the moon cast silver light across the ridges, I whispered to the last poacher, now silent and defeated, "This mountain is not yours. Never again." The forest held its breath. The night carried my words, and I knew deep down that the mountain was finally at peace. The night after the final confrontation was different. Quiet, but not the kind of quiet that presses like a shadow. This was the mountain's calm, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm, when every leaf, every rock, and every whispering breeze seems to settle into its place. I walked the trails slowly, boots crunching softly on the dirt, inspecting the paths where the poachers had walked, where they had struggled, where they had tried to defy the land. The traces of their trespass were still there, broken branches, trampled undergrowth, but now they felt like reminders rather than threats. Reminders that this mountain had a guardian, and that its voice could be heard in the rustle of leaves and the snap of a twig. I paused at the edge of a clearing, looking down at the valley below. The first light of dawn painted the peaks in gold, and I realized I could finally breathe again. My chest, tight from weeks of tension, loosened. Relief washed over me, but there was something deeper, a quiet pride that came not from defeating intruders, but from understanding the mountain itself. This land had tested me. It had forced me to be patient, to watch, to wait, and to act with precision. It had demanded vigilance, endurance, and respect. And in return, it had offered something rare, clarity. I had learned that to protect what you love, you sometimes have to confront darkness directly, but always with purpose. I returned to the cabin, the one small refuge I had carved out of the wilderness. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine and smoke, the scent of survival. I sat by the window, looking out at the peaks that had been my dream, my sanctuary, and my battlefield. I remembered the nights of fear, the adrenaline-fueled hours tracking shadows, the tense moments when every step could have been my last. And I smiled softly, thinking about how far I had come. The poachers were gone. They would carry their memories of this mountain forever, fear, exhaustion, and the knowledge that they had underestimated a place that did not forgive easily. I didn't celebrate their defeat with glee. There was no victory in cruelty. There was only justice, measured and exact, and the satisfaction of knowing that my home, my mountain, was safe once again. Days passed, and the mountain returned to its natural rhythm. Birds sang from the treetops, deer moved cautiously through the undergrowth, and the streams continued their endless journey through valleys and rocks. I walked the trails with a lighter heart, yet never fully relaxed. This mountain had taught me respect, and respect demanded awareness. I remained vigilant, not out of fear, but out of understanding that this land had a life and a will of its own. I began to think about the future differently. No longer just a place to escape the world, this mountain had become a mirror, reflecting strength, patience, and the quiet power of observation. I realized that the solitude I had once sought for peace was also a teacher of resilience. I had faced intruders, fear, and the unknown, and I had survived. At night, I would sit on the ridge, gazing at the stars. The sky stretched endlessly above, a vast canvas of light and darkness, much like the forest below. I whispered to the mountain a quiet promise: I will protect you, guard you, and honor you. And in return, teach me all you have to give. The wind swirled through the trees as if acknowledging the pact. Sometimes I still hear faint noises, shadows moving at the edge of vision, reminders that the wilderness is never completely still. But now, those sounds bring alertness instead of fear, curiosity instead of dread. I know the mountain, I know its rules, and I know my place within it. I am no longer just a visitor or a dreamer. I am its guardian. And so life settled into a rhythm, one measured by the rising and setting of the sun, the whisper of the wind, and the subtle lessons of the land. I walked the trails, tended the cabin, and watched as the forest healed, slowly reclaiming the marks left by trespassers. In the end, the mountain had taught me something I could never have learned anywhere else. True peace comes not from absence of danger, but from understanding it, confronting it, and standing firm when the time demands. I had survived, protected what was mine, and learned that even in the most remote places, courage and patience could turn fear into strength. And as the sun rose over the peaks, golden light spilling across the valleys, I smiled, knowing one thing for certain. This mountain was mine, and no one, no poacher, no intruder, no outsider, would ever walk it freely again. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.